And then came late August 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, and New Orleans' levees were breached, and the city was flooded. I was at home in New York. Like millions of other people around the country and around the world, I watched in horror as events unfolded in New Orleans. The thing that struck me the most was the sight of all those people trapped and stranded on their roofs, in their attics, and on freeway overpasses, as well as those who had been basically abandoned for days at these quote-unquote shelters of last resort, the Superdome and the New Orleans Convention Center. I struggled to put myself in the place of the people of the region, imagining what would it be like to be trapped in the floodwaters, to wade through chin-high water, to lose everything you owned to water and mold. For me, the overwhelming emotion was loss of people, of possessions, of government, of community, of trust in the accepted facts of life. I couldn't get a handle on all those different types of loss. And of course, my mind drifted back to 9/11. This time, my anxiety and my anger at the authorities, multiple failures, both before and after the storm and the flooding, had a focus and an antidote of sorts. Again, I volunteered. First, my wife and I spent time at the New York headquarters of the Red Cross, working with refugees who were straggling in from the Gulf Coast. That was not enough, however. I soon pursued training as a disaster response worker. 6 weeks after the hurricane, I was deployed to Biloxi, Mississippi, to help with the recovery efforts going on there. Mostly, I spent my 3-week assignment bringing prepared meals to residents of the flood zone, many of whom had lost everything in the hurricane. Now, of course, Biloxi and that region of the Gulf Coast suffered a very different fate than what befell New Orleans. In Biloxi, a 30-foot storm surge literally just wiped everything away in its path. And just to remind you, in New Orleans, they weren't actually hit by the hurricane, but rather it was the storm surge caused by the storm, which overtopped the levees and broke through the levees and overtopped the banks of the Mississippi, that ended up flooding the city. And the flooding didn't actually happen until almost a full day after the storm itself had passed. And it was this slow motion sort of death that happened with the city filling up like a bowl. So I'm telling you about this experience in Biloxi because it really served as a backdrop for my later work on AD. The things that I saw there, though, and the people that I talked to, helped me begin to understand the experiences of what it must have been like to live through Hurricane Katrina. This picture is from a visit I made to New Orleans that I took during my deployment. It's just a very poignant and also strangely, surrealistically humorous picture of this boat at a regular gas station for cars. But you can imagine that at one point there was a lot of water there. It was shortly after the water had finally been pumped out and the residents of the flooded areas hadn't been allowed to return yet. New Orleans was like a ghost town, a ghost city. I'll never forget the water lines that were 10 feet or more high on the sides of the buildings, or the code marks that were left by the search teams. So these marks were left to show, this was during the time that the water was still in the city, these various search teams, the Coast Guard or the other relief and Army, other rescue squads were going through the city in their boats, house by house, and searching to make sure that people weren't trapped or that there weren't dead people or animals inside, and they would leave these marks on each house, each and every house. I wrote about my volunteer experiences as they were happening on my blog. And in my post, I wrote about all sorts of things from my reaction to the hurricane, to signing up for Red Cross training, the conditions of the Gulf, working with survivors, visiting New Orleans, and much more. And being a public forum, my blog was read and commented on by people from all over the spectrum, not only by my friends my colleagues and regular readers, but by other Red Crossers, past and present, and by Biloxi area survivors and former residents. Eventually, I collected all the blog posts and many of the reader comments into a self-published zine I called Katrina Came Calling. I distributed the zine to all of those who were published in it, the various commenters, etc., and it even got a little press. It was written up in the USA Today and so forth. But I still wasn't ready to do anything comics related about Katrina. It felt too raw, too personal. I couldn't see a way in. However, a copy of Katrina Came Calling fell into the hands of the editor of a online nonfiction storytelling site called Smith Magazine. And soon enough, I was invited to do a webcomic treatment of the Katrina story on Smith. It was only then, a full year after the hurricane, that I finally felt able to think about doing such a project. And I decided to do it for two reasons. One was that I recognized the opportunity to tell what was clearly a very important story in a new way. Nobody had yet used the graphic novel format to deal with Katrina. And for me, of course, the comics format is particularly suited for this type of work. There's some things that you can convey in comics that you simply can't put into words. The medium's unique combination of pictures and text and the fragmented narrative of the panel-by-panel format engages the reader in a particularly active role of interpretation and inference. This image is from Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, which anyone who's interested in comics should read. So getting back to AD, in telling the story, I could focus on what I saw as the vital issues of the storm's aftermath. Not only the lost lives, the flooding, the personal displacement, and the loss of so many material possessions, but also the virtual abandonment of thousands of people at those shelters of last resort, and the misleading media coverage of those events. As New Orleans Times Picayune editor Jim Amos pointed out later, if the Dome and the Convention Center had harbored large numbers of middle-class white people, it would not have been as fertile a ground for this kind of rumor mongering. So just to refresh your memory again, in the days and weeks after the hurricane, there were a lot of stories in the press about supposed gangs of, crazy urban youth who were running around shooting each other and raping women and killing children and shooting at helicopters. It was all false. None of those stories were true. And in fact, as you find out in the book, a lot of the gangs that were at the Convention Center and the Superdome actually helped to deal with the overcrowding and the absence of real authority as well as they could. But these were the stories that were going around and everybody believed them. And when I heard Denise's story about what really happened there, that was a big reason why I wanted to have her voice as part of this. But I also see that I needed to do AD for myself. Subconsciously, I hoped that by telling these stories of trauma and heartbreak, I would find a way to process the lingering anxieties that I still had after 9/11. So these are the real characters from AD. Ultimately, I chose to tackle the multiple facets of the Katrina narrative through the voices of 6 real New Orleanians, folks from across the demographic spectrum with a range of backgrounds and storm-related experiences. I found my characters, quote unquote, in a number of different ways, through their blogs, through mutual friends, and through journalistic channels. As the group of individuals, Denise, Leo and Michelle, Abbas and Darnell, Kwame, and the doctor, took shape, I began to think of the project as kind of like a people's history of Hurricane Katrina. It was really important to me to get to the humanity of my subjects, to portray them as more than just victims. So I decided to show their lives before the hurricane, how they dealt with the storm as it hit, and during the flooding and direct aftermath, and where they ended up if they evacuated. By telling their stories, I hope to give readers a sense of the community of New Orleans as a whole, and how the story has continued to change since the catastrophic events of the storm and the flooding. Again, these were real people who agreed to have their stories told in the unusual graphic novel format and allowed me to intrude into every aspect of their lives in researching the story. I'm really grateful to them, especially since they've all continued to support AD in media appearances, book signings, and the like. And once I had done the research and interviewed everyone, I had to make them into comic book characters. So you can see that likenesses are not exactly my strong suit, but I found like that one distinguishing characteristic for each of them that made you be able to recognize them throughout the book. I spent about 4 months researching the project, preparing, learning about the storm, devising the format and content of the serialized webcomic.